Fascism as a term is disputed, not only within the broader public that either perceives of it as a historical relic or utilizes it for political persecution, but also within academia. Firstly, there's the discussion if fascism is purely a historical phenomenon, which should mainly be touched upon by historians and treated with care when extrapolated to contemporary developments, or if it instead has a core, or so-called fascist minimum, a core that can be traced through comparative research, and which surface can change per time or place, but whose core elements remain the same. Secondly, there are as many fascist theories as there are academics that study the topic. Now that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the field is quite fragmented. There are Marxists that predominantly perceive of fascism through the lens of class struggle, wherein fascism is the vanguard against the proletarian uprisings. Then there are decolonial theorists, such as Aimé Césaire, who build genealogies tracing the roots of fascism and Western imperialism, and argue that it is the practices and ideologies of colonialism turned inwards which we call fascism. This is, of course, a simplification of these theories, and there are many more strands within the study of fascism, each of which deserve proper attention. However, via this video I want to provide you with a short understanding of one strand of fascism studies, namely the cultural approach. The methodology of the cultural approach is not elaborately expounded upon in this book, and I will make a separate video dedicated to this, but it suffices to know that it builds a fascist minimum through the analysis of texts and other cultural products. To clarify, the cultural approach takes seriously the cultural products produced by fascists, products like manifestos and propaganda, philosophical arguments, or texts, to then, often through comparative analysis, come to the core of what forms fascism. An example of this methodology is the analysis of Mein Kampf and various other texts written before and during the Nazi rise of power to look for potential overlapping themes. The product of this analysis is not a definitive and fixed definition of fascism, but an ideal type, which Griffin describes as an artificially tidy model of the kinship that exists within a group of phenomena which, despite their differences, are sensed to have certain features in common. Such a model is essentially a utopia, since it cannot correspond exactly to anything in empirical reality, which is always irreducibly complex, messy, and unique. Definitions of generic terms can thus never be true to reality, but they can be more or less useful in investigating it, when applied as conceptual tools of analysis. It is in this Oxford Reader of Fascism that various fascist texts from Italy, Germany, but also Chile, Finland, Japan, Britain, and various other countries are provided to showcase what Griffin's definition is built on, and to familiarize the reader with the core elements that form the fascist minimum via examples. As the attentive listener may have noticed, the cultural approach does provide a fascist minimum, or core. And by sharing this approach, I'm picking sides in the first academic debate that I described. So for the sake of transparency, let me explain why I favor this approach. I understand the need for understanding fascism's historical specificity through economic, cultural, and institutional particularity of the countries that it arose in. Furthermore, I also agree that the task of developing a workable fascist minimum is complex and often results in either a too small or too broad of a definition. Lastly, I also share the worry that extrapolating the term to contemporary parties or movements can dilute from both the meaning that the historical concept carries, as well as from the conceptual rigor in the understanding of the contemporary phenomenon. Nonetheless, I favor this approach precisely because, in my opinion, fascism isn't an entirely historical phenomenon. Fascism as an ideology did not vanish after the Second World War, nor did its followers. Its texts and ideas, although perceived with taboo and first mostly circulating within obscure movements, remained a source of inspiration. Similarly, its followers joined new movements or political parties. These parties had different names and may formally proclaim to perpetuate its country's democratic values. However, slowly but surely, fascism has nestled and sprouted within Europe and all over the globe. A simple example hereof is Julius Evola, who was not only a part of Italy's fascist revolution, but also extensively wrote on its downfall and formed an important intellectual cornerstone in post-war fascist movements like Eurofascism and through Alexander Dugin as part of Neo-Eurasianism. So, with the methodology and relevance clarified, what fascist minimum does Griffin develop? Well, he bypasses the possibility of tracing a fascist minimum in terms of ideological similarities. Instead, he traces a shared mythic core. Griffin argues that the coherence between fascist movements exists not at the surface level of specific verbalized ideas, but at the structural level of the core myth which underlies them. With myth, he refers to an underlying image, which unleashes strong affective energies and can mobilize large groups that are affected by it. Furthermore, it is based on this myth that economic, cultural, and institutional particularities are utilized, which also explains the diversity in fascist movements. A fascist party in the Netherlands can build on different economic, cultural, and institutional ideas and practices than a fascist party in Mexico. What then is this myth underlying fascism? As Griffin puts it, it is the perceived crisis of the nation as betokening the birth pangs of a new order. It crystallizes in the image of the national community, once purged and rejuvenated, rising phoenix-like from the ashes of a morally bankrupt state system and the decadent culture associated with it. This image he summarizes in a single word, palingenesis, meaning rebirth, which stems from Greek palin, meaning again, and genesis, meaning birth. However, that is not the full mythic core. Griffin adds both a layer of ultranationalism and populism, creating the following definition. Fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. The latter two Griffin does not define in this Oxford Reader. However, it is provided in his book The Nature of Fascism, where he states that he is using populist not to refer to a specific historical experience, for example, late 19th century American or Russian populism, but as a generic term for political forces, which, even if led by a small elite of self-appointed vanguards, in practice or in principle, depend on people power as the basis for their legitimacy. He is using ultranationalism, which already has some currency in the political sciences, to refer to forms of nationalism, which go beyond and hence reject anything compatible with liberal institutions or with the tradition of the Enlightenment humanism which underpins it. This definition and his research into fascism leads Griffin to a set of 10 conclusions. Fascism is inherently anti-liberal, as its call for a heroic struggle for the rejuvenation of the state and the cleansing of its enemies radically rejects all aspects of liberalism, such as tolerance, parliamentary democracy, and individualism. It is also anti-conservative, even though it might draw upon history for an image of when the country was healthy, pure, and good, or as a reminder to its partisans of the nation's true nature. It pleads for a revolutionary renewal, which goes against the preservation of the current order often voiced by conservatives. It tends to operate as a charismatic form of politics. Griffin argues that all political ideologies are prone to charismatic aspects, when they operate as revolutionary forces. But fascism remained a charismatic form of politics when installed in power. Fascism is also anti-rational, not irrational, but it ascribes humanity's most distinctive faculty to its capacity of being inspired to heroic action and self-sacrifice through the power of belief, myth, symbols, and forces such as the nation, the leader, identity, or the regeneration of history. It can also partially utilize elements of socialism. Although it rejects the internationalism and materialism of Marxism, it can argue against capitalism as a destructive and parasitic force, against the purity of the nation. Furthermore, in its perception of the nation as an organism, it can argue for the transcendence of class conflict and reward all productive members of society. It has a link to totalitarianism. In its striving for a pure nation, fascism quickly leads towards the creation of a centralized total state with great power. This becomes especially predominant in its social engineering, which involve exercises in regimenting people's lives and the creation of an elaborate machinery for manufacturing consensus through propaganda and indoctrination, combined with repression and terror directed against alleged enemies, both internal and external, of the new order. Furthermore, fascism's support is heterogeneous. Its myth can touch every member of society, from each social class, gender, or background. It is also inherently racist, since all ultranationalisms are racist in the celebration of the alleged virtues and greatness of an organically conceived nation or culture. However, fascist ultranationalism does not necessarily involve biological or social Darwinian concepts of race, leading to eugenics, euthanasia, and attempted genocide. Nor does it necessarily involve anti-Semitism. It is instead more likely to build upon the already present political culture. Fascism can also be international. It does regard national distinctiveness and identity as primordial values, but it is quite capable of generating its own form of universalism or internationalism by fostering a kindred spirit and bond with fascists in other countries, engaged in an equivalent struggle for their own nation's palingenesis, often against common enemies, for instance liberals or communists. Lastly, it is eclectic, as each fascism will be made in the image or imaging of a particular national culture, and even within the same movement or party. Its most influential ideologues will represent a wide range of ideas and theories, sometimes quite incapable to be compatible with each other, except at the level of a shared mythic core of palingenetic ultranationalism. So, going back to the aforementioned usage of fascism by the broader public, what does this definition provide? Well, it revives the concept's relevance for contemporary debates, as it can bridge the spatial-temporal differences between fascism then and now. It is specific enough to avoid the weaponization of the term for political persecution. Furthermore, its focus on the mythic core explains both what fascism shares across time and place, and how it transforms through economic, cultural, and institutional particularities. The limitation? A focus on what fascists say, which does not always equate to what they do. But that will be a topic for future videos.